Hey there, and welcome back to the most entitled sim racing channel. My name's Erman, and I'll be your douche for this host for this evening. For the last couple of weeks, I've been wanting to do a series of videos about the things I would like to see added to, changed, or improved about basically all the major modern sims. Now, I found myself in a bit of a pickle there because I couldn't really start with one or the other because the inevitable tide of comments would follow saying, well, you're just shilling for this game or that game or whatever it might be on a given day. So to get around this problem, I concocted a wonderful idea. I'm just going to complain about all of them in the one video all together. Every single sim I've driven in the modern day is going to be covered. So never let it be said that this channel doesn't do equal opportunity complaining. To further get past any potential favoritism, we'll be featuring the sims purely in alphabetical order. As you might work out for yourself there, this most definitely leaves the best for last, so make sure to stay tuned in until the very end. Before we get into it though, make sure to hit that subscribe button down the bottom, like up the video, consider becoming a member of the channel for future sim racing inspired rants. We're beginning with ACC rather than AC because it's currently the benchmark of what Kunos is capable of as a sim racing developer. It's where their physics engine has arrived at in the modern day, and it's arguably what we'll be seeing going into Assetto Corsa 2. ACC is quite a remarkable sim because it started off in a very rough, borderline broken state in early access. The things that I didn't really like about it are things that over time were patched on and improved to a point where I find the driving experience quite serviceable, and with all the other elements and pros the sim has going for it, it comes together in what I believe is the most well-rounded GT3 and GT4 simulator available on the consumer market. It has, to me, very serviceable force feedback and very serviceable driving, which is patched up and propped up by the fact that they have such specific per car modeling and the fact that they're tied in so well with the racing teams and the manufacturers and able to extract all the relevant data for these cars. But now, because no sim is perfect, let's get into the things I would like to see improved about ACC in the future. The first one for me has to come from the force feedback engine. I've been quite vocal about this over the last couple of months, if not year or so. For me, ACC's force feedback distinctly lacks any kind of a mid-corner, weight transfer, indication of grip loss feel. It's very nebulous, it's very vague at the limit. So the way that you actually get quicker at driving cars in ACC, other than buying a motion rig, is basically just driving that car continuously on the track that you're training for, and you work out what the cues are based on the tire squeal, based on the speed of the car, based on all the other audio-visual cues that you're aware of, because much of it doesn't actually come from the steering wheel itself. So it's very difficult. It's not very precognizant as a force feedback engine like rFactors might be, with a lot of the artificial canned forces thrown in there, especially the lateral forces to really let you know what the car is planning to do at the limit. ACC very much has a different philosophy where it just kind of leaves it vague, assumes that you would somehow feel the weight transfer with your body, even though that force is not coming through for most of us, and it tends to leave a lot of us in the dark when we're trying to drive on the limit in ACC. The second thing is graphical optimization. Unreal 4 has been a very strange engine. I was a huge fan of the Unreal Engine 3 generation because it played host to some of my favorite games of all time. That said, Unreal 4 has always been a little bit spotty for me. It's always had this very strange, blurred out, kind of grayed out look with tons of pop-in and very strange visual presentation, especially of materials, and they seem to compensate for this by using artificial sharpening after all the mandatory anti-aliasing filters. Now, Assetto Corsa Competizione is no exception to this. While its graphics are on the whole fairly solid, some of the car finishes look really strange and flat and matte, with no particular detail. It's very uncanny valley, and moreover, the graphic optimization is very poor on most systems. I have a 3080 running at 4K, which for most cases is actually serviceable, but I'm well aware that most people are far off those specs and they still want to enjoy a modern day simulator. While Unreal Engine 4 is something I've never really seen optimized all that much, perhaps with the exception of titles like KartCraft, it would be nice to see them put a little more work into the coding under the hood just to make it a little bit more streamlined for those people on older hardware. 3. Grip loss behavior. One thing I could never gel with, both with Assetto Corsa and Assetto Corsa Competizione, is the fundamental feel of the cars at the limit. Now, I know that a lot of you old school AC guys will at least have my back on this when it comes to ACC. The lack of feeling of weight transfer, the way that the grip loss appears to be strangely simplified in a way. It's almost like a switch goes off and you suddenly go from having all the grip to none of the grip, and then a switch goes off again, you finally have all that grip back and you've got to snap for it. It's a very non-progressive grip loss model. Now, maybe the tire drop off is very, very quick and very, very steep after the sweet spot. Maybe that's what they're trying to indicate, but I can't help but feel that this is currently one of the major Achilles heels in the core driving model of ACC. If there's anything that would elevate the sim to the next level, it would be working on this grip loss behavior in tandem with that mid-corner weight transfer feel of the force feedback engine. 4. AI. You're going to see that this is a bit of a running motif for me for most of the major sims. AI in ACC, for the most part, is very serviceable. However, under many situations, the AI will treat you as if you don't exist and will simply pit maneuver your car out of the way. I've had this happen many races midway, several minutes in, if not an hour into a race, and it's been very, very frustrating to try and recover from. In fact, I have a running gag reel of the dozens of times this has happened for me, and I might actually superimpose some of that footage while I'm talking about this here. AI is something very, very difficult for developers to get right. Ultimately, we can never really simulate how a human would behave, and the day that we do, we'll probably get Skynet, so it's best that we avoid that anyway. But if we can just get the AI to be a little bit less homicidal under those situations where they might want to treat us like we don't exist, I think that will help push it the rest of the way. 5. Wet physics and live track system. So far, no sim has really nailed the wet physics experience, likely because there are so many elements at play and so much modeling that has to happen beyond just the pure raw dynamics of a piece of rubber that's inflated contacting a road surface. So this is completely understandable that it's been left by the wayside by most sim racing developers. ACC, while having a very good wet model, still doesn't have one that's quite lifelike, as we've heard voiced by the likes of James Baldwin, who's of course driven his virtual car in the real world, in the wet, and found it to actually be the case that he couldn't actually prep for that experience in the sim. Moving aside from the wet weather, we also have the live track system. It's been voiced a few times by the devs that for some reason with Unreal 4 they cannot implement a live track system or a real road system, the likes of rFactor 2 has, for instance. So what we tend to get is just 3 different states of the road which just kind of jump from one to the other very non-progressively. The problem with that is, of course, that it doesn't dynamically rubber in depending on where people are driving, so there's only the one idyllic rubbered in line. It shouldn't really need voicing why this is a problem, but one thing that we hope is with the coming of Assetto Corsa 2, should they move back to a proprietary engine, that they really get onto this, because it is a big aspect of modern sim racing titles, and it's probably something that people want to see. AMS2. An extremely immersive get-in-and-drive simulator that's just geared towards you getting right in there and having fun with a wide swath of content, very engaging force feedback, and just a focus on the fun experience of sim racing itself. As I'm sure you've noticed over the last year worth of content on this channel, I have no shortage of qualms with AMS2 despite all of that, so we'll get into those now. Physics, physics, physics. I can't say this enough, but AMS2 right now is probably closer to a game than it is a simulator. If you're okay with that, if you're okay plugging in your sim rig or your controller and just jumping onto a course in a car of your choosing and just getting in there and having fun, enjoying the sweeping changing weather effects, the changing time of day, and you just want to get in there and bounce around and race with your friends, then it's absolutely fantastic for that. So long as you're not looking for something to simulate the sensation of actual driving. One thing that I personally would like to see, especially since AMS2 is aiming to be a bona fide simulator, is more accurate car physics. I think we've done enough tests on this channel, we've done enough A to Bs and enough comparisons, especially the recent ones in the Nordschleife, where we can see the cars have a very peculiar behavior, shall we say, when they're driven at the limits, especially when it comes to protrusions in the road, vertical forces, and the way that they adhere to the road surface. The amount of grip tends to change very variably from being too much compared to real life to way too little compared to real life. Suspension behavior still needs a lot of work, and just there's so much that fundamentally needs to still be dialed in about this engine in order for it to be a true bona fide simulator. Number 2. Taking a page out of ACC's book. While this tends to be a bit of a controversial point because for a lot of people what they look for in sim racing is variety of content, people like myself just look for quality of content and realism, so I tend to prefer the hyper-focused approach. To that end, I believe AMS2 will be benefited a lot from simply putting out less content, but but putting a lot more focus on the quality of the content that they are bringing out. So for instance, if a Group C car were to come out, it doesn't help if it's just a reskinned other type of car with loosely the same physics and a couple of calculations and variables altered here and there to make it fit the archetype. I'd much rather they just spend some time, actually get out there, try to find one of these specimens still in operation, put a team out there, mic it up on the track, get some actual readings, talk to the manufacturers, try and actually get something that will connect the end sim driver to the experience of having driven the actual car. I feel like it would be way better had they spent 4 months getting that one car down perfectly, rather than spending that 4 months modeling 20 different cars across different classes, but having them all drive more or less interchangeably, and all more or less interchangeably weirdly too. 3. As a lifelong audio engineer, you probably already saw this coming, but better sounds. AMS2 needs a better sound engine in order to compete with the modern sims. Now don't get me wrong, it's very spotty. I know that some cars were done by different teams, I know that some cars sound far better than others, but for the most part we're looking for consistency and we're looking for a global elevation in sound quality. With titles such as Dirt Rally, ACC, and RaceRoom Race Experience leading the way when it comes to car sounds, it's very clear that they've gone out and actually mic'd these cars up. It's very difficult to compete when people are using found sounds from online YouTube dashboard footage, trying to put that together in the game engine and trying to get a synthesizer to fill in the rest. It's just not quite the immersive experience that the modern day sim racer craves, so definitely better sounds. 4. More consistency. You probably saw this coming a mile away, but I'm not really a big fan of the let's just throw a bunch of content at them and see as they pick through what they prefer, and then we'll kind of work on that and then abandon the rest. Especially when it comes to small teams, I think a hyper-focused approach becomes the best way to do this. I know it's harder to monetize because there's ultimately less content to drip feed to people as paid DLC, but ultimately you need to set the bar at a certain level to be able to be called a car simulator. Insofar as consistency goes, just seeing them elevate all of the cars to the driving level of their best ones, elevate their best ones yet again, and try to create something that would resemble a racing series. So if there's going to be a GT3 league, make sure there are enough GT3s to fill out the entire grid, and that they all drive reasonably well enough that they can be chosen interchangeably in regards to their BOP, rather than having one or two consistently being OP. While I understand that fundamentally that may not be the ethos of AMS2 and that fundamentally I might just be incompatible with the sim itself, I can't help but feel that having disparate levels of content, having a user pick through all of the dozens of cars on offer but not know what kind of experience they're going to get is fundamentally somewhat frustrating to the end consumer. This one almost goes without saying. AI. It's very obvious if you played AMS2 in pre-release, in early access, or even the early days of the 1.0 releases that the AI routines, for some reason from AMS1 that the community knew and loved, had to largely be abandoned, and they had to start again using a basis from the Madness engine. This was very obvious if you saw the AI cars with their jinking behavior, using the player as a battering ram, extreme rubber banding, much like the experience you would have had in Project Cars 2 and later on in Project Cars 3. So unfortunately, that to basically, in a very large sense, seemingly start again with these, it goes without saying that the AI needs a lot of work in AMS2 even to the modern day. They've improved it a lot, that goes without saying, but on some tracks you can still smash them when they're set to the max of 120, meanwhile on other tracks and other cars they'll smash you at half of that. There's a huge lack of consistency, there's still a lot of rubber banding where you really get the impression that the AI is on a completely different physics model to the player, being able to pull away on some corners, not be affected by hydroplaning like the player is. It can be an extremely frustrating experience driving against the AI, especially if you got weather changes scheduled in. Furthermore, because of the lack of online lobbies and online presence of AMS2, many of the user base are relegated to playing this offline against the AI. If they can't consistently race the AI, then all they have left is hot lapping or challenging the leaderboards all the time. Oh, iRacing. It just needs a different monetization system. RaceRoom is a sim that I just got into very recently. Just in the last 2 weeks, in fact, I had my very first ever drive with the old force feedback engine. With the coming of the new force feedback engine, RaceRoom is a sim that has really great natural feeling driving that's very joyful to drive, with a very natural and intuitive force feedback that feels very much like what I would expect from a real car with a hydraulic assisted power steering rack. So to that end, it's actually very fun from a core driving perspective. That being said, because the sim is extremely old running on an aged engine, there's no shortage of things we can pick through here, so let's just do that. 1. Probably the single most requested feature, if you want to call it a feature, from the community as far as I can see. An engine overhaul. People at least want to see it jump to DirectX 11, if not DirectX 12, if not just jump straight to Unreal Engine 4 or something hyper modern like that. Now I'm not too phased about graphics, I never have been. I fundamentally only care about the raw physics experience and how similar it is to driving the real car on the real track. That being said, the graphics engine in RaceRoom is so aged that the game is currently CPU limited. CPU limited on my 16-core Ryzen 5950X. It's so inefficient in regards to how it uses cores that it's very hard to even describe. Because of that fact, it makes it very difficult to enjoy under some circumstances, like when I try to run, let's say, a 100-car grid at the N24 layout. And let's face it, I mean, that's the only race that really matters, so if you can't emulate that, then what's the point of you existing? No, but seriously speaking, RaceRoom is running on extremely aged graphics. It's high time for them to upgrade it. I know they've hobbled it along for a really long time. Maybe they don't have the manpower, woman power, people power, whatever you want to call it, power to actually get it done, but it's definitely got to go up to be a priority sometime in the near future if they want to attract new consumers. Weather and nighttime. This probably doesn't even need qualifying. It's 2021. If you've got a racing simulator, you need to model nighttime and you need to model adverse weather. No more needs to be said. AI. Bet you didn't see this coming. Certainly not a running motif so far. The AI in RaceRoom under many conditions is fairly raceable, but under other conditions they'll quite happily use you as a battering ram as if you don't actually exist, and under others yet, you get a lot of crazy rubber banding type effects as they pull away from you in a way which would suggest that they're on completely different tires to what you are. RaceRoom doesn't need any more or less work on their AI than any other sim, but as always, we can always move that one step further to make the offline racing experience just that little bit more exciting. Laser scan tracks. This is probably the single most important one for me. The quality level of the tracks in RaceRoom is so spotty it actually takes away from the driving experience for me. Tracks like Spa are so far off that I just don't want to drive them whatsoever. Meanwhile, the laser scanned ones like the Nordschleife are like, yeah, this really brings to life the amazing fundamental driving model of this sim. Once again, Brands Hatch, maybe that's a slightly better scan, maybe it's just a slightly better implemented track, but that again feels way better than Spa. Move up to Bathurst, the dipper is wrong, the geometry is all wrong going up the hill. I mean, it's so spotty and it's so strange because each of these tracks costs a certain amount of money, and if you're going to charge a consumer money to get something, you might as well give them something that represents what they're buying. When you've got sims such as rFactor 2 and ACC leading the way with their new track designs, doing insane granularity level laser scan tracks, you simply cannot put out the quality level of tracks that RaceRoom is peddling right now. And finally, the really big one from the community. Less convoluted monetization. Pretty much everybody universally hates their virtual currency system, although we all know by now that they're doing it to circumvent Steam, charging them 30% on every sale. Obviously, for a small developer, 30% is a massive middleman fee, and they can use every bit of that, I'm sure, to pay the wages of all the people involved in running the studio. That aside, there has to be a slightly better way of handling things that's more fair to the end user rather than ripping off the ones that are on Steam and trying to kind of get packages going using your virtual currency as a middleman medium rather than just charging a certain amount of money for what it is that you're selling. I think pretty much everybody is in agreement here. It's a very difficult system to justify. I'm sure the developers aren't thrilled about it either. It's a tricky situation, but I hope they're able to work something out in time. Finally, we're down to rFactor 2. rFactor. I could keep this going for weeks. rFactor 2. Historically, my favorite sim since I got into sim racing, but progressively, the more I learnt about it, the more I got into the ecosystem, the more I tried to actually do things with it other than race offline, the more I realize that it just is virtually a non-starter in many regards. Very difficult to justify these days, but I'm going to go over the long list of things which I think I've done very well over the last few months to hold myself back from doing specific videos dedicated to these things, because they have frustrated me to no end, not only as a sim racer, but as the managing director of a company who deals with company direction and marketing on a fairly daily basis. Watching the things that they do as a business baffles me to no end, and we're going to go over some of these things here today and list some things that I think could help improve rFactor. Firstly, let's list some of the positives in rFactor 2, and you can't get past the fundamentally joyful, interactive driving model with the very involving force feedback that's hyper-saturated with information to keep you going. Even the lateral force stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be feeling through the wheel in real life. They've just thrown it all in there to just get you driving the car to the edge from the moment you get in there, which is a cool philosophy. May not be the most realistic way, but it's certainly one of the more engaging ways. That is taking place on some of the most immaculately laser scanned and modeled tracks in all of sim racing. Everything from Spa, the Nürburgring, Monza, Sebring, Le Mans, Monaco even under a different moniker. They have so many tracks now done to pinnacle level detail, and when things go well in rFactor 2, they can lead to a transcendent driving experience. The problem is that they very rarely go well, and I'm going to detail over the next couple of minutes why that is. 1. The UI. Again, Studio 397 have had a new UI in development for some years to replace the archaic 90s Excel spreadsheet weird archaic looking UI one that rFactor 2 started with. You can tell it was a title built by coders, for coders. It was almost like the sim racing equivalent of trying to run Linux. But the idea was to modernize that with a new UI, which we all waited very patiently for many years, as apparently the workload was quite intense to get this done, and it took precedence over a lot of the other things that some people may have suggested were more important, like getting the physics to drive like a real car. But anyhow, a couple of months ago, that UI came out and it became standardized. We're all forced over to it after a period of brief overlap with the beta or the opt-in releases. Using the new UI, you were immediately hit with the sensation of 1. It takes more clicks to achieve something than it did with the old UI, so fundamentally from a user perspective, it's less efficient. 2. It responds more slowly than the old UI. There's more lag, there's more loading time, so in that sense, again, less efficient than the original 90s spreadsheet looking UI. 3. It became very obvious very quickly that this UI was just a reskin to the same fundamental feature set running the old one. The setup screens were virtually identical. The features you would get on a single screen in the past were now tabbed out over multiple screens, requiring more clicks and more downtime and more waiting for the UI to load elements for you. But the fundamental options were still virtually identical. Very little, if anything, actually changed in that regard. So the core functionality remained. It wasn't streamlined. In fact, it became the opposite. It became more difficult to set up a race under a given set of parameters than it was on the old archaic UI. And many of us ended up in a position where we were actually begging to get put back on the old UI. Now, if I can think of a textbook example of a UX design failure, it's rFactor 2. The entire user experience, from start to end, knowing what you're going to get when you purchase the vanilla version of rFactor 2 and what you have to buy through DLC. They need a standardized way of showing what it is that you're going to get, to which quality level, and what else you're going to need to buy in order to become competitive or get the pinnacle rFactor 2 experience. For well over a year now, ever since I started this channel, I've been getting questions from people, my friends, goes without saying prior to starting this channel, but many dozens of people after starting the channel. Erman, what do I need to buy? How do I get the content that you showed me? I don't understand. How do I buy it? Through what tab do I go? that the fundamental user experience is so broken in rFactor 2 that it simply turns people away. There has to be a list somewhere, centralized, of what it is that you're getting, to what level of quality it drives, and what else you need to buy in order to get the best possible experience out of rFactor. People need to budget, they need to project, they need to understand how much the entire experience is going to cost them to get the experience that they want out of the title. Furthermore, the diving through the config files has to go. I can't believe I'm saying this in 2021. People should not be digging through JSON files because everybody knows how to do it. Everybody doesn't know how to do it. Nobody knows how to do it. People learn how to do it because they have to, trawling through forum threads rather than just getting in there and driving your title. That's the problem. Consistency. Right? We're seeing a motif running here through the sims. Consistency is massive. Of course, when you hand off sim development from one developer to another, and they develop it over the course of many years, almost running on a decade now, things are going to vary in quality quite substantially, as various aspects of the physics model get updated on some cars but get left behind on others. That goes without saying. As a result, one thing that rFactor needs to do is prune all of its old content. If something sucks, get rid of it until you modernize it. Don't put it in the base vanilla version of the game, because that's the first impression people are going to get of the sim. Package the GT3s with it. Give them Sebring, give them Le Mans, give them something really good to be like, wow, is this a drip feed? Is this a taste of what rFactor can be if I spend da-da-da amount of money in it? Consistency is everything. Get all the cars driving on the same quality of tire model, get them all on the same quality of aero model, get all of your tracks up to the same standard as Sebring, Le Mans, Monza, and only then can you actually project and provide a unified experience for the gamer that doesn't confound and confuse the hell out of them. People have been asking for this one on the forums for many years before I actually drove in rFactor, but a proper transmission and drivetrain model. The way the clutch operates, the revving inertia, it just needs a little bit of work. There needs to be a little bit more modeling in the way that the power delivery is handled on that level. I don't really want to get into detail here. If you want to read more about this, you can look into the forum. This has been a much requested feature for many years, but driving rFactor at low speeds as a result, or especially when you're trying to get the clutch to bite in first gear, is not a very fun experience, and yeah, it'd be nice to see them move past that. The tires. I bet you didn't see that one coming. Definitely not a long requested feature of many years, pushed aside in order to get the new UI done, to get the new competition system done. Just a side note, not very important, just a fundamental way that the cars interact with the road surface. That's not that important, really. So, the tires. I did a very somewhat long video about this called Are rFactor 2's Physics Broken? Something to that effect. Made me very popular with the community, as you can imagine. But that video kind of explains some of the issues with rFactor 2's current tire model of some of the more recent content. You can essentially overpush the cars on the limit, basically get bogus times by just driving in a way that would in no way work in the real world. For a sim priding itself as the pinnacle of all simulation, that's just fundamentally unacceptable. I mean, it's just not acceptable. If your goal is to be the most complete simulation out there, that's priority number one. There's no competition system, there's no UI, there's nothing else. There's just the physics, there's the raw driving experience, and then for you to actually make money as a business, there's the user experience. You need to make it easy to buy, you need to make people understand what they're getting, and then you need to make sure that it drives right at that pinnacle that you're promising them. The tires, they need to be fixed. Stability and bug fixing. As of several months ago, I used to be able to run my Fanatec DD1 wheelbase with rFactor 2 in a very intuitive way. I'd leave my wheelbase set to auto rotation and the game would adjust the car to my steering rack. It was amazing, it was great, I didn't really have to worry about anything. As of a particular update, that functionality inexplicably broke. And since that moment, it's never been fixed. To this day, if I want to drive an rFactor, I have to manually assign my steering wheel rotation lock to whichever car it is that I'm trying to drive. That's just one example of a long-standing bug in their engine that's just gone by unaddressed and unnoticed, seemingly. One of the problems with this is that rFactor has a litany of these. There are so many issues with the AI, the way that they pit in wet weather, the way that they can just black flag races, the way that you can get... So one of the things that has been long known in the community is if you drive with all the flags enabled in a single player race, you have a very high chance of just driving around under full course yellow for the entire race and then just having all the AI go into the pits. And that's your race. Several of my friends had this as their very first rFactor 2 racing experience. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a better way to self-sabotage when it comes to a new player with rFactor 2? I can't for the life of me understand, is the manpower so low that these fundamental issues simply can't get solved over the course of half a decade? It boggles my mind dealing with coders, dealing with people who run bug fixes. I mean, you have a priority order. You have a development roadmap. You have different teams handling new development, one handling legacy bug fixes. I mean, is that not a thing? Are we too focused on some random F1 car that nobody asked for, that nobody cares about? We're still going to leave completely broken AI in the title, completely broken force feedback. rFactor. It's pretty obvious by this point that the game has outgrown its physics engine. The devs are consistently trying to upgrade it, first to move to a higher level of DirectX, now with the physically based rendering shaders, and the upgrades are so gradual, and all they're doing at this point in time are serving to divide the quality of the content up even more, make it feel even more spotty, less consistent, and just less unified as a whole. It's come time to get the raw physics engine of rFactor 2, take what you can, and port it over to rFactor 3. What they're trying to do with the graphics upgrades is just barely treading water. They're barely several years behind the rest of the gaming industry when it comes to fidelity. Sure, they're trying to add in nice new reflections, SSR, PBR, whatever else the buzzword is going to be. Maybe we'll get ray trace reflections at some point in time, but that doesn't fundamentally matter when the car quality is so spotty. I mean, you can go into an old GT3, it just looks like a potato on the inside, jump to the new Bentley or something, or the 488, and then looks completely different, like they've actually tried to model the interior. And the question is just like, at what point is all of this going to unify? When is it going to create, the one singular experience for the sim racer where they don't have to worry, like, can I drive this car or can't I? Has it been updated or hasn't it? It's time for rFactor 3. It really is. There's what you can do with this engine. It's long been on its last legs, and it's time to just take the core physics, take what's good about the title, ditch the rest, and just start again. And lastly, better management direction. I think we can kind of infer this based on what I've been saying up until this point, but the direction of this company baffles me to no end. It's almost like they want to keep it as some kind of an elitist haven where you have to dig through JSON files to get a basic race set up, where you have to know the ins and outs, where you have to have trawled the forum for years in order to understand how to run elementary basics of the title. It's an extremely punishing way to try to present a game, and it will never be ready for any kind of a mass market or even, beyond sub-niche market when it comes to such an extremely high entry curve. There needs to be a shift top down. Every time Studio 397 come out with a new track and a new car, I think to myself, this came at the expense of what? Did it come at the expense of the years of bug fixes that needed to happen with the UI, with the AI, with the driving model? We have a new car that drives weirdly, rather than having a legacy bunch of dozens of cars that'll finally drive normally after years and years and years. I fundamentally cannot understand what the direction behind that company. I don't understand what it is that they're trying to achieve, because their movements are at odds with their explicitly stated aims. Anyway, guys, that's it for rFactor and the bulk of the main real sims that I drive in the modern day. I apologize if I got a little bit impassioned by the end there. I always knew that rFactor would be the big one. As you can tell, I've been having some internal difficulties dealing with what they've been doing over the last several months. And perhaps this was a way to voice some of that and help some of you understand why I've had a bit of a shift in the way that I present rFactor 2 to the community. Hopefully you can, get on that same level, or perhaps you'll tell me why you disagree fundamentally. Either which way, that's where I'm at with it at this time. And now for our honourable runners-up. Games which aren't necessarily racing sims in the truest sense, but ones that I still drive on a fairly regular basis and I want to cover. First one is beamNG. beamNG doesn't need any improvements. beamNG is perfect. beamNG was created perfect, and every new beamNG update is like a gift from the gods being bestowed down upon us, lowly mortals. Dirt Rally 2 and F1 2020/2021. Both of these are Codemasters games that have a lot of the same fundaments, so I'm bundling them together because they really kind of require the same improvements, at least according to my opinion. Both of these are extremely immersive games that are fun and very quick to get into with great career progression modes. Because they're more mainstream titles, they tend to lack on a few fronts that the more hardcore sim racing elite would want to see. The first one, of course, is physics. The physics are just, they're not really there in either title. F1 2020, the only one that I've driven, I mean, is a far cry from even the old Assetto Corsa. The problem I understand is, of course, the more realistic you make it, the more you alienate the core user base, which is basically just plebs who want to play with a controller on a couch, which is totally fine. There's a way more lucrative market, and that's definitely the market that Codemasters go for. Ditto with Dirt Rally 2. While it's a great entryway into rally driving, even with all the assists of full realism, full wheel, whatever you want to call it, it is fundamentally, we could call it SimCady at best. I mean, you can drive a rally stage in beamNG to really get a feel for what rally can actually be would they pull their finger out. But of course, again, Codemasters won't want to do this because it's going to alienate the wider player base who just want to get in and pretend that they're a really sick driver without knowing anything about driving. The other one for me with both games is the force feedback engines. They're very much like the old RaceRoom engine that's just based on a threshold array of canned forces. How much of this effect do you want? How much of that effect do you want? I mean, this is ultimately something the developers should be telling us based on the steering geometry, the suspension geometry, the torque being actually given to us through the steering column of the particular car that we're driving. These should not be forces being levied on the player to actually set up. But unfortunately, when you're basically running your entire force feedback engine as a collection of different canned forces, that's about as good as it can get. Now, while the force feedback engine as a result is left as very flexible, it's just needlessly convoluted and just feels like crap under all settings, if I'm honest. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that long diatribe about all the things that I want to see improved upon in just about all the modern sims I could think of that I drive in the modern day. At the very least, I hope I can't be accused of being a shill in favor of one rather than the other, because I feel like the hate was very much equilateral here. But maybe that can be the complaint, that I whine too much, which is totally apt. All the same, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you agree with many of these? Do you disagree with many of them? Whatever the case, make sure to hit that sub to stay up to date with future sim racing news and reviews. Consider joining the channel and do check our affiliate links to help support the channel in the future. Until the next one, I'll see you guys later.